Hello, I am Gepwin. Welcome to another Factory Town tutorial. This time we are going to be covering logistics blocks, which are distinct from but connected to logic blocks. I know a lot of people are confused by logic blocks, and that is a tutorial I'm going to be getting to later. This is the prerequisite tutorial because you need to understand logistics blocks before you can understand logic blocks. They are linked, and these ones are easier. A couple things to get out of the way. First, I have a few notes. If you want to skip over those and get to the tutorial bit, there are links in the description with time codes that will take you to whatever it is you are looking for. First, normal disclaimer. This is an early access game tutorial, which means that things are going to change in the future. It is inevitable. I am currently recording this on Factory Town version 0.10. In very late March. The further away from that you get, the less like this tutorial the game may or may not be. Check the description and comments for updates, changes, corrections, etc. This is a set of blocks called logistics blocks. You can find them in the menu under logistics blocks. They are unlocked after researching logistics in the school building when you first start the game. I'm going to go through them in the order in which they appear in the menu very briefly, and then we're going to go over them in a different order when I explain them. I hope that's not confusing for people. We start with the barrier gate. This blocks items moving through it, and you can open and close it. It works very, very similar to something like a blocker, which does more or less the same thing, except that the blocker can be filtered. Rail stops will be added to this menu when you research rail lines. They are the only thing that can load or unload rail cars. We're going to be going over them very briefly at the end, but this is not going to be a dedicated rail video. That's going to be coming later. One-way blocks are very weird. They cannot be interacted with in any way, shape, or form, but they do make entities that move through them only move in a single direction. We'll be covering those more extensively in a second because they are odd. Sorters and pushers do basically the same thing. They will push items off of belts in the direction that the arrows are pointing. They have a slightly bit of different functionality that we'll get to. Grabbers give you an output anywhere from any building that can output. You can use these to put items onto belts or other contraptions anywhere that is not the little output arrow of a building that it normally has. Splitters do what it says on the box. You put them on a belt or etc., and they will split items in one of the three directions. So you can take a single belt line and split it into up to 3 belt lines using one splitter. Blockers stop items from moving, basically the same as a barrier gate, but very slightly different functionality. And filters are the inverse of a blocker. They will only let through items when they are on and certain things, so we'll be covering that in a little bit as well. The first of the logistics blocks we're going to be covering is by far one of the weirdest. It is the one-way block. It works fairly differently from all of the other blocks in the game, but there are some things that are the same, and I'm going to cover how to place them and such here. This is the same for all the other logistics blocks. You place logistics blocks by grabbing them out of the menu and left-clicking. Right-clicking on them does very little, basically nothing for these particular blocks. One-way blocks do not have the menu in the upper right that gives you the functionality. Other blocks do. That is where all of the functionality will be. If you want to get rid of them, you can use your remove block tool on them. You can also click them and hit delete, which will get rid of them the same way as a building. One-way blocks specifically are very odd because they are the only of the logistics blocks that do not really work on belts. You see, I put them on this belt and they have done nothing. The items are still moving through this one-way block. If I hit R to rotate it, now they cannot move because it is sideways. If I move it that way, they can move through because it is normal. So items cannot move through a one-way block sideways. It will, I believe, push. No, it won't. Okay. Wow. One-way blocks on belts are very, very, very weird. Very weird. Don't use them. One-way blocks are not meant to work on belts in any event. They do basically nothing but mess things up, as you have just seen. I don't even know how they work on belts, and now it's going through normally again. Don't use them on belts. What they are for is this situation here with wagons and other entities moving around in the world. Wagons, as you see, these ones here, try to path as efficiently as they can, but they get in each other's way. You see how weird and wonky the movements are of these wagons as they go back and forth trying to carry items around. So you can take your one-way blocks and you can use them to control the wagons, because what one-way blocks do, they allow entities to enter from any side, but they can only exit from the arrow side. They cannot enter from the arrow side. The other sides they can enter on fine. Now you see how we have created a little loop just by adding these two one-way blocks, which prevents the wagons from going back along the path in which they just came. You can, of course, use these to completely block entities, because if we put one-way blocks on either side here, this wagon can't actually leave because it cannot move through the arrow. If we rotate this, it will be able to leave because it can enter from the side, but it has to follow the direction of the arrow once it is inside the block. It can enter from any of these three sides, it cannot enter from the arrow facing side, and it can only leave from the arrow facing side. That is one-way blocks. This is the only thing you will basically be using one-way blocks for, is wagons. They do affect workers. However, as you see, workers can move back and forth in the same path very, very easily and seldom get in each other's way. But if you use one-way blocks, workers will still follow them normally. They just have trouble with it. You cannot use them on boats for the simple reason that you cannot place them above the water. If it is a block that a boat can go on, a one-way block cannot be placed there. These are underneath the boats, and it will only affect boats if the boat is inside the block. It only affects entities that can go inside the block, so that are on the same level as the block. So these boats will never ever be affected by these one-way blocks. One-way blocks do affect minecarts. As you see, I've set up this little minecart route here that uses a pusher that I will explain later. I've set up this little minecart route here that goes around and around in a circle. If we grab a one-way block and we put it on the rail line, it does block the minecart and keeps it from leaving if it is sideways. It can enter from any direction, but it can only leave through the one. That's it. It's pretty useless with minecarts because of the way that minecarts only move on a track, but you can use one-way blocks with them. It's just not particularly useful. So one-way blocks will affect any entity moving around in the world. They work really, really weirdly on belts. I would recommend not using them on belts and chutes. With pushers out of the way, every other block in the game works on belts or chutes. One thing to note about using these on chutes, I'm going to be demonstrating them with belts, which work the way that I'm going to explain here. Belts don't have to connect to each other in the same kind of way that chutes do. If you are using these items with chutes, the chutes have to have a valid path. So let's say that you wanted to use logistics blocks to move items on this chute. This would work okay. You'd be able to move items over straight to the right and down because you have this valid curve. If you had your chutes set up so that they did not have the normal curve like this, the items would not be able to move from one chute to another. So everything that I say about using these on belts is going to work more or less the same as chutes, but the chutes have to have a valid chute path, which means that they have to have the actual curve that will let items normally move from one chute to another. So I've made this little system here. And the first thing we're going to talk about is pushers. So as normal, if we have a worker bring wood over to this belt, the wood's going to just travel straight along this belt until it gets to this silo. Even if we have another belt line next to it, this wood still travels past onto the silo. It only works on the belt lines if we put the curve right there, and then it will go on a turn. But what if we want to do this with another means? Well, that is what this pusher is for. Pushers do basically what they sound like. Items will enter the pusher and they will get pushed in the direction of the arrow, and they will move over as long as there is a valid place for them to be. If there's not a valid place for them to be, they can't. So for example, if this belt backs up, they will stop being pushed by the pusher and it will move through. The thing with pushers is items can enter from any direction, and they will get pushed as long as there is a valid place for them to be pushed to. For example, these items are entering the pusher from the arrow side, but because they can't actually move out backwards onto a belt that is facing into the pusher, they're just moving down. If this pusher was pointing out to a valid direction, then it would push items that way. And it will push items that way until there is no valid way for it to go, and then it will go whichever way the items would have gone without the pusher being there. Now, one additional thing with pushers and a lot of other blocks is their filtering. So if I put down a pusher, and you click on it, you see that it has several interactivities up on the right corner here. Let's just give it a valid place to go. So we have this active status on, means that the pusher will do what it is doing. It is pushing wood onto the lower belt. If we turn it off, the pusher no longer pushes. This is what you are going to control with your logic blocks. This is why you need to know how logistics blocks works before you know how logic blocks work. Logic blocks will control this on-off status of logistics blocks. The other thing that you can do with logistics blocks is set an item filter. So right now this item is just pushing everything. If we set it to stone, you see that the wood just goes through. The wood just passes right through the pusher and is unaffected. If we put some stone on this belt, as well as the wood, then the stone will get pushed and the wood will continue going through, effectively giving you a little bit of a sorting system on this belt. The one thing to keep in mind with pushers, however, is they still work like pushers. So if we remove the place for this stone to go, and this belt fills up with stone, then the stone will move through like normal, because that is what pushers do. Pushers will push when there is an available area for them to push to, but they will not push when there is no available area for them to push to. They will just let items through, whether you have a filter set or not. If you want items to work that way, then what you need to do is use the pusher's little cousin, the sorter. Now, a sorter works in exactly the same way as a pusher. It will push all items that it goes to. If you apply a filter, it will only push that certain items that are filtered. Items can enter from any side, but will only leave in the direction that the arrow is pointing. And you can turn it on and off with this activator. The difference with a sorter is that if there is nowhere for the items to go, instead of just pushing them along anyway, it will stop. Items that enter a sorter can only leave through that arrow. So if the arrow is blocked, the items will stop at the sorter. This is useful for sorting systems where you have to make sure that 100% of your items go on another belt. For example, if this was going into something that only uses wood, if this was going into a lumber mill that could only use wood, and having a stone on the belt would back up the entire system, it's better to back it up here where you can see it than to back it up over there and not mess up your system. So that is what sorters are for. Sorters are pushers that work in absolutes. A pusher will let items go through when it cannot push. A sorter will not let items go through when it cannot push. The other thing to notice with a sorter is this is an older technique, but one thing that you can do with sorters is if you set a sorter to be an item that is not going to appear on the belt. For example, people like to use coins. Back when you could put coins in them. I don't see them anymore. But let's use, nails. Nails aren't going to appear on this belt. This means nothing is actually being let through the sorter. Unless you turn it off, then everything will be let through the sorter. You turn it on, nothing will go through the sorter. This used to be more useful than it is, but it is still an interesting thing that you can do with sorters. Just as an aside, you see on my little contraption here, I have set up a pusher to sort stone off of this belt into this silo so that we can keep things going around in a circle. That's one of the things that you can do with sorters and pushers. This one I use a pusher because I'm never going to have more than 100 stone in this system, so there will always be room in this silo. If you were worried about this silo backing up and it messing up your system by having stone trying to go into this lower wood silo and messing things up, you would use a sorter here instead of a pusher. The next block works just like the other two, except for it can push things in multiple directions. That is your splitter block. Now, a splitter is an interesting one. The splitter works exactly the same way. Stuff can enter from any side, except for the front. Items cannot enter through the front of a splitter. They will not leave, because there is no valid place for them to go here. So the splitter will let items out in any direction that it can. So you can have it facing this way, and sometimes it will let stuff in and sometimes it won't. You see how it's a little wonky. I would recommend against it. It seems to be a little off and on depending on when you put it down. But it'll let items in from what we will call the sides. It'll let items in from what we will call the back, which is the direction that does not have an arrow. If you have it facing the front, it'll let stuff through if you kind of put it down immediately, but not otherwise. Now, the splitter right now is just letting items through like normal because it has nothing else to do. There are no other valid locations for it to push items to. But what the splitter does is it can split items on a belt. It'll let every other item go through. So when you have it going to two directions, every other item gets pushed down. One goes forward, one goes down. One goes forward, one goes down. Every other item. And the same holds true when you have it facing in three directions. Now, a splitter can split in up to 3 directions from one input. This one, for example, is sending one item to the top, one item to the bottom, one item to the front, and it is alternating. So the way that it's set up here, you're going one up, one forward, one down, one up, one forward, one down. That is how splitters basically function. Now, if I put the splitter sideways, it's going to only split in the directions of the arrows. So having the splitter sideways, even though there's a valid location out the back of it here, it's not going to send anything in that direction. It only sends things in the direction of the arrows. So if you have a tight system and you have some belt lines that you don't want to send items to with your splitters, you can put them in this kind of area sideways, we will say, so that the back is not facing a valid location. The back is not a valid location. It will only push to valid locations. It will also let through items when everything is full. So if this belt line becomes full, then the splitter is going to stop trying to split, and it's just going to let everything through on the main belt line. The splitter is not going to stop items from moving. Now, the splitter has the same basic functionality as the others. You can turn it on and off. Off basically just means that things will move through the splitter as normal. On means that the splitter will try to push to valid locations around it. You can also set a filter on the splitter. I don't know how this would be useful, but I'm sure people could figure it out. This means that the only things it will try to split are what is in the filter. However, it will still let stuff through because the front, as we've seen before, is still a valid split location. So all of the wood that goes through will go through normally on the main middle belt here, but the stone will get split between all of the 3 belts. I can see this being useful if you have like one line that's carrying a lot of items and you want them to be able to split off easily but still maintain a certain amount of items on the main line. I think that's not super common, but I can see some use cases for it. That is everything that you need to know about splitters. Now we've got 2 more blocks here for belts, which are the blocker and the filter, and then we'll get into the one that you will be using most often, which is going to be the grabber. So the blocker and the filters work more or less the same way. Blockers prevent items from entering them from any direction. They do not have a directionality to them. Blockers prevent anything from going into them when they are on. When you turn them off, they let things through as normal. When they're on, they stop everything going through. If we set this filter to stone, it will only block stone. It will let through other things. So let's just turn this belt around so that we can demonstrate here. Let's send the woodworker down to the bottom here. So you see that this is blocking stone from going through, but it is letting wood through. So the filter on a blocker is what it will not let pass. And again, if you turn it off, it'll start letting stuff go through as normal. If you turn it on, it will stop things. But it's important to remember that the filter on the blocker is what will not be let through. The filter works in the opposite way. Right now, when the filter is on and you have nothing, it just lets everything through. If you turn the filter off, same thing. It just lets everything through because it is off. But if you filter by stone this time, now it lets through stone, but it does not let through wood. So a filter works in exactly the opposite way as a blocker. The filter will only let through what it is filtering and not anything else, whereas the blocker will not let through what it is filtering and will let through everything else. So the blocker and the filter are kind of inverse. The filter is somewhat unique in that it is the only one of these items that will only function if you set it to have a filter. Everything else does something if it doesn't have a filter. But this one, if you set the filter to nothing, the filter block does nothing. It just lets everything through. So this is the only block in the game with logistics that you have to set a filter on before it will work. Now, here's one that most people probably know already, but we're going to have it for completeness, the grabber. Now, the grabber is pretty unique in that it really doesn't do anything if you put it onto belts. The grabber does not work with belts at all. You see, everything is just passing through the belt, and it's not doing anything. The grabber works with buildings. So, let's get rid of these two workers. They have served their purpose. When you have a building in Factorio that can have an output, it has this large green arrow on it. Now, this green arrow, as you probably know from the other tutorials, is where this will output items. So, if we put a belt up to this green arrow, this silo will output wood onto this belt. Let's just, come on, remove that. But if we have the belt going next to the silo, it's not going to output anything. See, this silo will output where the big green arrow is, but it won't output onto this side belt, no matter what we do. Belts that are kind of in other orientations next to the silo are not going to have any items put onto them. That is where the grabber comes in. You put a grabber next to a building, and it has to be facing away from the building. This is the thing with grabbers. We put it here next to the building, it does nothing. We put it so that it's facing out of the building, and it goes onto this belt. The other thing that I see people confused about with grabbers is if you just have a grabber by itself, it does nothing. Grabbers need to have a belt under them. They will not push through. They will push to, if that makes any sense. So you see the grabber here will not take items out of the silo into the grabber and then onto the belt. No, it will take items out of the silo and onto the grabber and put them onto a belt or chute that is underneath the grabber. So that is the function of grabbers. Now, grabbers are interesting because you can turn them on and off like normal, like all the other blocks. And when you turn them off, they stop grabbing things out of this silo, just like that. You can also use them to filter items. This silo, of course, can only have one item in it, so let's make a quick demonstration case here. Now, unlike silos, barns can hold multiple items at the same time. You see, this barn has 100 wood and 100 stone in it. Now, if we took a belt and we just had it on the output of this barn, it would output wood, and then it would output stone. This one's probably only going to output wood because it's just going to cycle through and it's going to keep trying to draw from the same inventory. But it would output all of its wood and then it would start outputting its stone, or you wouldn't be able to get the stone out of it in this kind of case if you had too much wood in the building. So it's just not very workable to have something with multiple inventory slots holding multiple items going out into one belt using only the output here. What we need to do with this is to use grabbers. So put a belt on a place that is not the main output. Grabbers will not work on the main output of the building. Pause the game so that the grabber doesn't start just grabbing stuff as soon as you put it down. And then set the filter. Now, if we set this filter to stone, this grabber is only going to grab stone. There we are. So this grabber only grabs stone. This belt could grab stone or wood. If it ran out of wood, if something changed in the way it was grabbing, it could grab stone. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, this isn't a very good demonstration of this. But what we can do to make sure that this building is only giving us what we want it to give us is set one grabber for wood and one grabber for stone. And now you can have it output based on the filter. And the other great thing with grabbers, as we already covered, is you can have them grab out from anywhere on any side of a building. So this building normally only has one output, but since you can grab from any side of the building, it actually has, 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12 just going around. That is just 12 outputs you can have from this one barn going around it. The other thing with these is if you combine them with structural blocks, with scaffold blocks, you can actually build multi-level. You can put a belt up on a scaffold block with a grabber, and that grabber is going to grab out onto that belt up to 3 levels high on buildings. So now we can have... Come on, there we go. Now we can have this grabbing out of the top of the barn and the bottom of the barn. You can even stack these. There's a slightly more advanced thing, but we will just show just because. If you have a belt coming out of a building, you can actually put down a grabber. I'm sorry, I keep messing around the menu. You can put down a grabber, it will grab out of the barn. And then you can go into your structural blocks, and you can use one of the pillars. You can use wood scaffold pillar or stone scaffold pillar. And then you put a wood arch to prevent the scaffolding from getting in the way of the belt. And then you just build another belt on top of that, which we'll have go off this way, so that's not, interfering. You can have another belt coming off of the top of that, and you put another grabber up on that, and now we have a stacked output. So grabbers are basically the bread and butter of everything you are going to be doing when you are using logistics blocks. Your grabber is probably your most common logistics block. It lets you grab items out of any side of any building, and if you set a filter on them, they will only grab one thing out of the building. And if you hook them up to logic blocks, which we'll cover in a later tutorial, you can turn them on and off and control how many items you are taking out of a building. Very, very, very useful logistics block are the grabbers. Now, there's a couple of logistics blocks that we have not covered yet, one of which is the barrier gate. Now, the barrier gate is a weird one. The barrier gate you can place onto places here. It will block things. It'll block things kind of in any orientation, even though it looks like it should have to be sideways. You can rotate it with the R key, just like everything else. It looks like it should only work when it's sideways. It'll actually work in any orientation. And if you turn the barrier gate on or off, which is now in the lower right, if you turn it off, items move through. If you turn it on, items stop. It's basically the same as a blocker, but it can't be filtered. You can't filter items with it. The other thing that makes it a little bit different is nothing. It's a more aesthetically pleasing version of the blocker. Because one thing that we didn't cover is blockers can actually... Oh, blockers should be able to stop these. I guess they only work on rail lines. My apologies. So, barrier gates work on entities in the world. And blockers don't work on wagons, even though they work on rails. We'll cover rails in a second, because rails are a little bit weird. But if we put a barrier gate down here, you see, now they move around. Unfortunately, let's just make sure that they can't actually do that by blocking them. There. You can't move through there. Stop that. You're not allowed to do that. Fine. Just... I'm sorry, this is not cooperating. Wow, they're very determined to get over there. Anyway, you can see that the barrier gate is blocking the way that the carts can come and go. If you open the barrier gate, now the carts can move as normal and just go the way that they were going. So barrier gates can block carts, and they can block rail lines. That is the main thing you're going to use them for, is to block rail lines. Unfortunately, I need to get rid of these. There we go. So rail lines are a little bit weird as far as they go for logistics blocks, because they are affected by more things than other entities are. So if we go in and we put down a minecart, You see the way that I've set this up, I even have a pusher. The minecart is affected by pushers. The minecart goes up this branch, hits the pusher, and comes back. This is how you can have a one-way system, a one rail line system instead of a loop, because pushers will affect minecarts. Also, filters will affect minecarts. Right now I have this set up so the minecart has to turn, but if we don't have it set up that way, it will keep going around and around. If we set up a pusher here, then this minecart will go up with the pusher, it'll go back down, and it will keep going back and forth because it's on this one little 1x1 line. If we set up a pusher with a filter, then this empty rail cart will go straight through. There it is. But if we add wood to this rail cart, any amount of wood, then this filter, this pusher or filter, will start pushing the rail cart. The other very interesting thing here, if we remove the wood from the rail cart, now it's not going to be affected by that pusher anymore. But the interesting thing on rail carts is you can filter rail carts themselves. This changes what you can put in and out of a rail cart. If you set the filter of a rail cart to wood, you set the filter of the rail cart to wood. There we are. Even though this rail cart is empty, it's now going to be affected by that pusher, because the filter that you have set on the minecart itself affects what is filtered with pushers. This is the barest overview because we are just covering the very, very basics. Now, barrier gates placed on rails will block minecarts. That double-clicked. Barrier gates block minecarts, and then if we open it up, it unblocks. Now that was a control left click. If you control left click, it will turn things on and off. It's a very useful tool to use. If you just click, it will select, and you have to hit this on and off. If you control left click, it will turn on and off. The other thing here is if we go into logistics blocks and set blockers, the blocker will block the minecart until you turn it on or off. Oh, I guess it just activates. It activates the state. I apologize, it does not turn it on or off, it just sends an activation pulse, which of course toggles the barrier gate, but it wouldn't toggle a blocker. My apologies. Blockers will work with this if you turn it on or off, and if you have it set to filter, it's going to work too, because this minecart here is set for wood, and if it is empty, it is not going to be carrying anything. So if we set it to none and it's not carrying anything, it'll also go through the blocker. Minecarts are a very weird amalgamation of a entity that moves through the world like a cart and a belt that is affected by item filters. It's a very, very weird amalgamation. Now, some of this also works on carts. Some of the filters and things also work on carts, but carts can move around things, which makes it very unuseful, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining it. Now, the other thing here, if we grab a couple of silos, this rail cart will need the other logistics blocks, which is a rail stop, which automatically is put down if you build a building next to a rail line with the little arrow. That automatically puts down a rail stop. But if you have the building pointing in any direction, this rail stop is going to work just like a grabber. As long as this rail stop is pointing out of a building, regardless of where the directional green arrow for the output of the building is going, it will let the rail cart grab things out of this building. The same goes for the other way. So if we have a rail stop, we go into logistics and we grab a rail stop. You can have the rail stop also go into another building. Red means output. You see here, output is red. Rail stop input is green. So if we put some wood in this building, let's just put 20 wood in here so that we have the max amount that can be carried by a rail cart. This silo now has wood in it. This minecart will go around, it will grab wood. It will fill itself completely as soon as it enters this rail stop. It'll grab as many items as it can out of this building. See, it just immediately grabbed 20 items. And then it'll drop as many items as it can into that building. There we are. Now it won't be able to grab because there's nothing else. The other thing that you can do with these, you can set these to input, output, or in and out. In and out means if it can grab items, it should grab items, and it doesn't. I don't know what in and out. In and out doesn't seem to work very interestingly. Let's put it going that way. I'm not sure what the in and out does with this. to be honest with you. I probably shouldn't have covered it. In and out doesn't work the way that you think it does. I need to do some research on that, and I'm going to cover it in the dedicated rail tutorial that I'm planning later on. Just know that it won't do the thing that you think, where it will just take items out and put items in. What if we turn this off? Does nothing. So, yeah, in and out doesn't work the way that you would think it should. But we can change these. If we turn these around and do, you know, input, output on that one, and turn this one around and turn it to output. Sorry. Turn this one to input. There we are. Now we've just turned the system around without having to do anything to the minecart itself. Wait. Why did this stop working? Oh, whoops. Output. Input. It would help if I remembered which one was which. Now we've just turned the minecart, now we've just switched the system around without doing anything. I always keep some mistakes in my tutorials so that you can see, one, I make them too, and also how to work around them with your mistakes. So this has been the overview of logistics blocks in Factory Town. I hope you found it helpful. Later on, we're going to do the logic block tutorial, and you have to understand how logistics blocks works in order to understand logic blocks. So I hope that you watched this one first and you enjoyed it. When I have the logic block tutorial out, there will be a link to that one in the description as well, so you can move straight to that one from this one. It's going to be a little bit, though, because these tutorials take a weirdly long time to think through and make, despite me being able to record them fairly quickly. I hope that you liked it. If you did, there's a bunch of YouTube things you can do, like leaving a like and subscribing. That helps out, lets me know that you like the tutorials and that I should do more of them. Also helps people find the tutorials on the large morass of videos that is modern YouTube. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I or someone else will be able to answer them for you. And again, check down in the comments and descriptions for any corrections or changes that have happened since this video was made. My name's Gepwin. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.